The chandelier above us cost more than my first apartment, a fitting halo for the Sterling family legacy. I stood near the periphery, gripping a sparkling water, watching the vultures circle. Vanessa cornered me before I could escape to the terrace. Still running that pathetic little shop, my sister mocked. My phone buzzed. Sir, the merger is complete. You now own 60% of their company. My father's whiskey glass slipped from his hand. The notification glowed. A digital guillotine blade waiting to drop. Crystal shattered against the marble floor, a violent punctuation mark that silenced the string quartet instantly. Amber liquid splashed onto my father's hand, stitched Italian loafers, staining the leather dark. He stared at me, his face draining of color, until he looked like one of the wax figures he so often ridiculed. Guests froze, champagne flutes halfway to their lips, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. It wasn't just a dropped glass, it was the sound of a dynasty cracking down the middle. The silence was absolute. Vanessa laughed nervously, a high-pitched trill meant to diffuse the sudden tension. She assumed the old man was having a stroke or a drunken stumble. "Oh, Daddy, really?" she chided, signaling a waiter to clean the mess. She turned her sneer back to me, smoothing her silk dress. "Jerry, don't just stand there gaping. Go get him a napkin. It's not like you have anything important to do." She still saw me as the errand boy. She had no idea she was fired. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The screen of my phone was still illuminated, displaying the finalized transfer codes from the Securities and Exchange Commission. For 10 years, they had called my algorithmic trading firm a hobby, a cute distraction for the slow child. They never bothered to check the profit and loss statements or the client list. If they had, they might have noticed that my little shop had been quietly purchasing their distressed debt since the second quarter of last year. It wasn't an accident, my father whispered, ignoring the servant dabbing at his shoes. His eyes were locked on my device. Then, they drifted up to meet my gaze. He saw something there he hadn't recognized in 3 decades' competence. The bloodshot veins in his eyes seemed to vibrate. He knew the numbers were bad. He knew the sharks were circling. He just never imagined the shark would be wearing a cheap suit and standing in his own living room. The realization paralyzed him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and sleety. It wasn't a request. Vanessa opened her mouth to berate me for my tone, but Arthur raised a trembling hand to silence her. The power in the room had physically shifted, gravitating away from the tuxedoed patriarch and settling onto my shoulders. "The library," Arthur choked out, turning away from his confused guests. I followed him, stepping over the broken glass. It crunched satisfyingly beneath my heel. The party was finally over. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, muffling the festive strings of the quartet outside. The library smelled of aged leather and unearned confidence. A sanctuary where my father had dictated the fates of lesser men for 40 years. Arthur marched to his desk, swiping a crystal decanter aside to lean over the polished wood. "Enough of this theater," he hissed, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge. "Show me the real numbers, Jerry." The joke is over. He still believed he was in charge. I placed my phone on the center of the green blotter, the screen casting a harsh blue light on his knuckles. Raid Line 4, Arthur. Regulation 13D filing. The Securities and Exchange Commission doesn't appreciate jokes. The document was irrevocable proof. A digital chain of custody that led directly to my holding company. Vanessa burst through the doors, her heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood. She looked more annoyed than afraid, clutching her purse like a weapon. The investors are asking questions, she snapped. Tell them the truth, I said, leaning back against a bookshelf filled with first editions nobody ever read. Tell them management has changed effective immediately. Vanessa rolled her eyes, a gesture of practiced dismissal she had perfected in high school. You hacked a web page, Jerry. That's adorable. She pulled out her own phone, dialing with aggressive jabs. I am calling Jenkins. He'll have you arrested for corporate espionage before the appetizers are cleared. She put the call on speaker, confident in her inevitable victory. The line rang twice before the chief legal officer picked up. The background noise of the party filtered through his end. He was likely near the buffet. Vanessa? Jenkins asked, his mouth full. Jenkins, my brother is showing us some forged acquisition documents. Threaten him, she commanded. A long, agonizing pause followed. The chewing stopped. Vanessa. I was about to find you. We just got the alert from the registrar. The transfer is valid. It cleared 10 minutes ago. Vanessa dropped her phone. It bounced on the Persian rug, Jenkins still stammering apologies from the floor. Arthur sank into his high, backed leather chair, the leather groaning under his sudden dead weight. How? He whispered, staring at the ceiling. Your shop. It repairs laptops. I shook my head, walking over to the Globe bar in the corner. We build high-frequency trading algorithms, Dad. While you were leveraging the company to buy yachts, my code was buying your distressed bonds. I didn't pour a drink. I needed a clear head for the dissection. You ignored the renewable energy sector because the margins were too thin. I reminded them. My little shop didn't just buy your debt. We used the profits from the exact markets Vanessa called hippie nonsense to fund the acquisition. The irony hit her like a physical slap. Her arrogance hadn't just blinded her, it had financed her own destruction. She slumped against the doorframe. Her designer dress suddenly, looking like a costume. Arthur reached for the decanter, his hand shaking violently, but I intercepted it. I corked the bottle and placed it out of his reach. Sobriety is required for the audit, I said coldly. I'll see you at the board meeting on Monday. 9 sharp. Don't be late, I hate tardiness in my employees. I walked past them, leaving the heavy doors open. The party noise flooded back in. But for the Sterling family, the music had definitively stopped. Saturday morning sunlight didn't penetrate the server room. The air was kept at a crisp 60 degrees, smelling of ozone and ionized dust. I swiped my keycard, passing rows of humming black monoliths. This was the little shop, Vanessa mocked. No grease, no broken laptop screens. Just $40 million of hardware crunching petabytes of global market data every second. I touched a cooling fin, feeling the vibration of pure commerce. It hummed with a power they couldn't comprehend. Marcus was waiting in the glass-walled command center, a tablet hovering over the holographic table. He didn't look up when I entered. He was too busy dissecting the carcass of Sterling Corp. You are early, he muttered, sliding a digital file across the surface. And you look like you slept in that suit. I poured a black coffee from the carafe. I didn't sleep. I was watching their stock futures bleed. Marcus finally looked up. It's worse than we thought, Jerry. The main screen flickered to life, displaying a web of red lines choking the Sterling logistical map. They haven't updated their supply chain software since 2015. Marcus explained, pointing to a cluster of failed nodes in Southeast Asia. They're paying triple for shipping, because Vanessa insisted on using her husband's logistics firm. I clenched my jaw. It wasn't just incompetence. It was nepotism masquerading as strategy. They were burning cash to keep the family warm while the ship sank. That's standard corruption, I said, dismissing the shipping costs. Show me the liquidity crisis. Arthur tried to sell a warehouse last week. Why? Marcus tapped a few keys, isolating the executive discretionary accounts. A new graph appeared, jagged and erratic. Here. The consulting fees ledger. $2 million a month leaving the company. Routed to a shell corporation in the Caymans. It looked like embezzlement. But the pattern was too desperate. Too irregular. It didn't look like greed, it looked like panic. I zoomed in on the transaction dates. The 14th of January. The 3rd of February. The 10th of March. I recognized the timeline immediately from the gossip columns. These align with the Macau high roller weekends. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Arthur wasn't just stealing, he was covering gambling losses. He was betting the company pension fund on baccarat tables and losing. The magnitude of the betrayal shifted. This wasn't just bad business, this was criminal negligence on a massive scale. If we expose this, he goes to federal prison, Marcus said quietly, voicing the thought I was afraid to articulate. He looked at me, gauging my resolve. The board doesn't know. If they did, they'd sue him for everything he owns. I stared at the screen, seeing not numbers, but the faces of 3,000 employees whose retirement funds were currently sitting in a casino dealer's tray. My moral line had to be drawn in concrete, not sand. Prepare the forensic report, I ordered, turning away from the damning evidence. We aren't just taking over on Monday. We are performing an amputation. Marcus nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard to lock down the evidence before Arthur could scrub it. What about Vanessa? She's complicit if she signed off on these. I looked at the red lines one last time. She didn't sign off. Look at the authorization key. It was my mother's digital signature. The corruption was total. Rain lashed against the floor, tip-sealing windows of Vanessa's penthouse. She paced the imported rug, phone pressed to her ear, wine glass dangerously tilted. She was calling Simon Vance, the board's oldest member. Simon, you can't be serious. He's a mechanic, she hissed, her reflection looking ghostly in the glass. We need your vote to block the motion. The line crackled with static, or maybe just hesitation. Simon's voice was cold. He's not a mechanic, Vanessa. He owns the debt. Across town, Arthur sat in his private study, the air thick with stale cigar smoke. He was shouting at his broker on a burner phone. Sell the Aspen Lodge. Sell the Jaguar collection. I need liquid cash by morning. He slammed his fist onto the desk, rattling a framed photo of the family he was actively betraying. What do you mean frozen? It's my property. The broker's reply was faint but terminal. The assets were tied to corporate collateral. Jerry locked the vault. Vanessa ended the call with Simon and immediately dialed Elena, the head of HR. Elena, darling. She started. Voice sickeningly sweet. I need dirt on Jerry. Unpaid parking tickets, college scandals, anything. She waited, twisting a diamond ring on her finger until the skin turned white. What do you mean is clean? Everyone has secrets. Elena's response was blunt. Jerry didn't have secrets, he had receipts. Vanessa threw the wine glass. It shattered against the wall, leaving a blood-red stain. My phone buzzed at 2 a.m. I was still at the server farm, watching the monitors pulse with data. It was Arthur. I answered on the first ring, putting him on speaker. You are destroying the family name, he slurred, liquor clearly doing the talking. Well, built this from nothing. I watched a security feed of him stumbling around his study. You didn't build it, Dad. Grandfather did. You just mortgaged it. His breathing was ragged, wet with rage and fear. The board won't back a hostile takeover, Arthur threatened, trying to regain his footing. They are loyal to me. I typed a command, sending a secure file to his personal email. Check your inbox, Arthur. I didn't buy their loyalty. The silence on the other end was heavy. I had sent him the forensic accounting of his gambling losses. I showed them the theft. They aren't backing me because they like me. They're backing me to avoid being sued. Vanessa's phone rang again. It wasn't an ally, it was the CLO Jenkins. The new majority shareholder has requested an emergency audit of the consulting fees ledger, Jenkins said, his voice trembling. Vanessa froze. She knew those ledgers. She had seen her mother signing off on them for years, assuming it was tax avoidance. If that comes out, she whispered. It's already out, Jenkins confirmed. Jerry sent the preliminary findings to the board's audit committee an hour ago. The trap had snapped shut. The storm outside battered the city, but the chaos inside the Sterling Empire was man-made. Arthur slumped in his chair, the phone slipping from his grip. Vanessa stared at the red stain on her wall, realizing it looked like a crime scene. They had spent the weekend looking for leverage, but they were standing on a trapdoor I had built 2 years ago. Loyalty in business has a price tag, and I had paid it. Tomorrow, I would come to collect. Monday morning broke with a gray, clinical light that made the Sterling Corp glass facade look like a tombstone. I stepped out of my sedan, not waiting for a driver I didn't hire. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pavement and city exhaust. Usually, I entered through the side door near the loading dock, wearing headphones to ignore the whispers of the staff. Today, I walked straight toward the revolving main doors. My reflection in the glass didn't look like the spare hair anymore. It looked like the landlord. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and wasted budget. 2 security guards, Mike and Sal, stood by the turnstiles. For years, they had waved me through with pitying smiles, checking my badge like I was a lost visitor. Today, Sal stiffened as I approached, his hand twitching toward his radio. "Mr. Sterling," he stammered, abandoning the familiar Jerry. He unhooked the velvet rope usually reserved for board members. The scanner beeped green before I even touched it. My access level was already global. I stepped into the executive elevator, the one that required a biometric key. The doors slid shut, sealing me in silence. I watched the floor numbers climb, each ding counting down the seconds to my family's eviction. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the cold anticipation of a surgeon scrubbing in for a difficult procedure. I checked my tie in the mirrored walls. It was cheap polyester, a stark contrast to the Italian silk my father wore. It didn't matter. The suit doesn't make the man, the equity does. The 42nd floor was silent, thick with the scent of fresh lilies and fear. I walked down the long corridor lined with oil portraits of the CEOs. My grandfather looked stern. My father looked smug. I stopped in front of Arthur's painting, noting the artist had generously thinned his face and brightened his eyes. It was a lie in oil paint, just like the quarterly reports were lies in ink. I touched the frame. It was cold. By noon, this wall would need redecorating. The executive suite was usually buzzing with assistants and sycophants. Today it was a ghost town. Desks were abandoned, computer screens dark. The only sound came from Vanessa's office at the end of the hall. A rhythmic, mechanical grinding. I pushed the door open without knocking. The room was a disaster zone of open file boxes and scattered papers. Vanessa stood by the industrial shredder, feeding it thick stacks of paper. She looked manic, her hair frizzy and wild, sweat causing her mascara to run down her cheeks. It's over, Vanessa, I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the machine. She jumped, jamming the shredder with too many pages. The motor whined and died, filling the room with the smell of burning plastic. You can't come in here, she screamed, grabbing a heavy binder to shield herself. This is private property. She looked pathetic, clutching the evidence of her own incompetence. I own the building, I corrected gently. And I own the shredder you just broke. She threw the binder onto her desk, defeated. You won't find anything, she spat, trying to regain her composure. The paper trail's gone. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city I now commanded. Vanessa. We backed up the servers remotely on Saturday night. I turned back to see the blood drain from her face. Paper trails are so 1990. We have the cloud logs. I tapped my temple. Every deleted email's already printed and waiting in the boardroom. The boardroom was an expanse of polished mahogany and dread. Arthur sat at the head, clutching a coffee mug like a lifeline. His eyes bloodshot from a sleepless weekend of panic. The 12 board members shifted in their ergonomic leather chairs, avoiding eye contact with the man they were about to execute. I walked in, placing my laptop on the far end of the table. The click of the lid opening echoed like a gunshot. Arthur cleared his throat, attempting to summon his fading authority. You are late, Jerry. Sit down. I didn't sit. Instead, I walked the length of the table, my footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. I stopped directly behind Arthur's chair, looming over him. You are in my seat, Arthur. The silence stretched, tight and suffocating. Vanessa gasped from the corner, looking ready to throw another object. Arthur's face flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. This is preposterous. He sputtered, looking to the board for support. They stared at their tablets, studying the agenda I had sent. Move. I repeated softly. Or security will move you. Arthur stood up slowly, his joints popping, and shuffled to a side chair. I took the head seat and connected the HDMI cable. The massive screen descended from the ceiling, humming with lethal intent. Let's begin with operations, I said, bypassing the pleasantries. A graph appeared, a steep red cliff dropping into an abyss. This represents the logistics division under Vanessa's supervision for the last 8 quarters. I pointed a laser at the nadir. That is a 40% loss in market share. You were shipping air. Vanessa slammed her hand on the table, her bracelets jingling aggressively. The global market was in a recession. Everyone lost money in shipping. I clicked the remote. A green line superimposed itself over her red one, climbing steadily upward. The green line is my little shop, Vanessa. We use the same shipping lanes and global economy. The difference is, I used algorithms to optimize routes, and you used your husband's trucking company. The board members murmured, scribbling notes. Her defense crumbled instantly. I didn't let her respond. I advanced the slide. The screen shifted to a complex web of wire transfers. Incompetence is expensive, but theft is fatal. I looked directly at Arthur. He shrank into his suit, suddenly looking very small. These are the consulting fees, paid to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. $2 million a month. Simon Vance, the board director, finally looked up. We were told those were retainer fees for legal counsel, he said, his voice ice cold. Who is the beneficiary? I pulled up the beneficiary data. The account is linked to the Diamond Sands Casino in Macau. A collective gasp went around the room. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was on the screen in high definition. Arthur covered his face with his hands. It was a loan. He mumbled into his palms. I was going to pay it back. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. You use the employee pension fund as collateral, Dad. That's not a loan. It is grand larceny. Vanessa stood up, tears streaming down her face, but they looked rehearsed. How can you do this to us? We are your family. We gave you everything. She pointed an accusing finger at me. We paid for your college. We gave you a home. It was the last card in their deck. Emotional blackmail. I felt a twinge of the old guilt, the conditioned response to please them. But then I looked at the pension numbers again. The guilt evaporated, replaced by cold, hard resolve. You gave me a basement in mockery, I corrected. And while you were busy playing aristocrats, my little shop was outperforming this entire conglomerate with 6 employees and a server rack. I projected aside. By side comparison of our net profits, the disparity was comical. I didn't steal this company, Vanessa. I saved it from you. The board members were nodding now. They weren't looking at a son usurping his father. They were looking at a CEO replacing a liability. The shift was complete. Arthur looked up, his eyes pleading. Fine. You win. You run the company. Just keep the Sterling name. It's all we have. I shook my head slowly. That's the problem, Arthur. The Sterling name is toxic. The market associates it with failure and fraud. I clicked to the final slide. A new logo appeared, sharp, modern, slept and unrecognizable. Effective immediately, Sterling Corp is being dissolved into a subsidiary of my holding company. The name goes down with the ship. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a dying legacy. Arthur looked like he had been physically struck. Vanessa slumped in her chair, staring blankly at the new logo that erased her identity. The board has heard the proposal, I said, looking at Simon. The air in the boardroom was recycled and stale, carrying the metallic taste of adrenaline. Simon Vance tapped his stylus against the table, the rhythm sounding like a ticking clock. We've seen the evidence, Simon announced, his voice devoid of its usual deference. The motion on the floor is the immediate removal of Arthur and Vanessa Sterling from all executive positions. Arthur looked up, his eyes glassy. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a bribe, but no sound came out. He was already a ghost. The vote was a necessary cruelty. All in favor? Simon asked, raising his hand without hesitation. One by one, 12 hands rose. It was a silent forest of betrayal. Even the members Arthur had taken golfing last week voted against him. Vanessa let out a strangled sob, realizing her social calendar had just evaporated. She looked for a sympathetic face, but found only averted gazes. They weren't voting against friends. They were voting for survival. The motion carries unanimously, Simon declared. The gavel didn't bang, but the impact was just as final. The Sterling era was officially dead. Arthur slumped forward, his forehead resting on the cool mahogany. You can't do this, Jerry, he whispered. I am this company. He looked at me, tears cutting tracks through his face powder. Let me stay on as chairman emeritus. Just a title. Something to save face at the club. It was pathetic. He didn't care about the fraud. He only cared about his lunch reservation. He was bargaining for his ego while the building burned. I felt a pang of pity, but I strangled it immediately. Vanessa took a different approach. She stood up, knocking her chair backward. You ungrateful parasite! She screamed, face twisting into venom.
We fed you. We clothed you.
You would be nothing without us. She lunged, but a security guard stepped out, blocking her path. She recoiled, looking at him like he was filth. Don't touch me, she spat. Her entitlement was a reflex impossible to remove. She didn't see a brother. She saw a servant who had forgotten his place. It was repulsive. I ignored her outburst and pulled 2 thick envelopes from my briefcase. I slid them down the table. They spun across the polished wood, stopping perfectly in front of them. "You have 2 choices," I stated. "Option A is in front of you. It is a generous severance package, retention of personal assets, and a quiet retirement." I tapped the table. "It comes with a strict NDA. You walk away, you keep your houses, and you never speak about this company again." Arthur reached for the envelope, but I held up a finger. "Or there is option B." I nodded to Marcus, who projected the forensic accounting file onto the screen. "I hand these files to the district attorney. We prosecute for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty." I looked them in the eye. "You lose the houses. You lose the cars. You go to federal prison for 10 years. The room went deadly silent. It wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a hostage situation, and I held the gun. Arthur didn't hesitate. The threat of prison shattered whatever pride he had left. He grabbed the pen, signing the agreement so hard the tip tore through the paper. He was selling his legacy to save his skin. Vanessa hesitated, looking at the document like a death warrant. "Sign it, Vanessa," Arthur croaked. "It's over." She let out a whimper, snatched the pen, and scrawled her name. With those signatures, the Sterling dynasty officially ended. They were just wealthy unemployed citizens now. "Take them to the lobby," I ordered. "Do not let them return to their offices. Personal effects will be mailed." Sal stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. My father flinched, looking at me with betrayal. "I am your father," he whispered one last time. "And I am the CEO," I replied. "Security, please." They were guided out, Arthur shuffling like an old man, Vanessa weeping into her hands. The door clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, final, and hollow. The board members began to pack up, avoiding my gaze. They respected the power move, but they feared the man who could execute his own kin. I walked to the window, watching 2 tiny figures emerge onto the sidewalk 40 stories below. They looked insignificant from this height, just 2 more pedestrians in the rain. I waited for the rush of victory, the thrill of revenge, but I felt nothing. It was just a transaction. I had cut out the cancer, but I had also cut out my history. Simon Vance stopped by the door. "We'll reconvene next week for the rebranding," he said, voice cautious. "Good work today, Mr. Sterling." He left. I stood alone in the empty boardroom, the smell of my father's cologne still lingering. I looked at the signed NDAs on the table. They were legal proof of my success. As the elevator dinged in the hallway, signaling their final departure, the truth settled in. I was finally the king, but as the doors closed, I realized I was also an orphan by choice. 1 week later, the silence was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of the boardroom, but the rhythmic hum of cooling fans. I sat in my original office at the server farm, ignoring the corner suite downtown. The CEO's chair was empty, gathering dust while I worked here. My monitors glowed with the green lines of recovery. The stock had bounced back 8% since the public announcement. The market loved ruthlessness. I typed a command, watching the code execute. It was cleaner than family politics. My personal phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating against the metal surface. It was my mother. She hadn't called during the purge, but she was calling now. I let it ring until it died. The voicemail notification popped up a moment later. "Jerry, please. Your father is depressed. We need to pay the club fees." I stared at the screen. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. She just wanted the checkbook back. I deleted the thread without replying. Marcus walked in, carrying 2 coffees in cardboard cups. He looked around the cramped office, then at the layout of the massive headquarters on his tablet. You know you own a 40-story building, right? He asked, sitting on a stack of manuals. The corner office has a private shower and a view of the harbor. I took the coffee. It was hot and bitter. Just how I liked it. The view from here is better, I replied, pointing to the efficiency metrics on my screen. For years, I thought I wanted them to see me. I thought if I made enough money, they would stop mocking the little shop. But standing in the wreckage of their empire, I realized I never needed their respect. I just needed them out of my way. The need for validation had died the moment Arthur signed that paper. I wasn't the spare heir anymore. I was the architect. It wasn't happiness. It was weightlessness. The gravity of their expectation was gone. We need a name for the holding company, Marcus said, scrolling through branding options. Sterling Global is dead. What do we put on the letterhead? I looked at the server racks, the flashing lights that had built my fortune while my family slept. They called it a repair shop. They called it pathetic. I picked up a marker and walked to the whiteboard. I wrote one word. Novus. It meant new. It meant mine. Marcus nodded, closing his tablet. Novus it is. I stayed late that night, long after Marcus left. The hum of the servers was a lullaby, drowning out the memory of screaming relatives. I walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where my sensible sedan sat alone, under a streetlight. I didn't need the yacht or the gala. I sat back down at my desk, opening a new terminal window. It was just a little shop, but it was the only empire I ever actually wanted.